All right, hello everyone, and so I would like to explain the differences between capitalism and socialism, and I'm going to explain how. Sorry, I gotta close the door. So I would like to explain how capitalism is different from socialism, and also I would like to explain to people that today we do not live in a capitalist society. Around the world, or even in just Western civilizations like the US, Canada, Britain, and so on, right? These are actually socialist economies, right? Most accurately, mixed economies, right? But really, people don't really understand what capitalism is. People don't understand economics in general. So I'm going to provide some education in this video. And remember, this video is purely for educational and entertainment purposes. So look, right, we're gonna begin with the very basic fundamental of economics. Okay, well, let's begin with the fundamentals of actions first, right? Of human interactions. Well, first let's begin with action. So what is action? Right, action is purposeful behavior, right? This is just praxeology. Right, and how do I change the text? I swear, whoever made this program is retarded. Like, I don't know. All right, so look, action. What is action? Right, action is purposeful behavior, as praxeology states, right? And right, and it's always an action is always a selection between A or B. So it's it's a selection among alternatives, right? And so let's say we got Bob over here, right? And he's gonna choose chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream, right? And so he chooses chocolate ice cream, and this implies a preference, right? So actions always imply a preference. A preference is a rank ordering of one thing over another, right? Right. So an action is basically a choice, right? It's purposeful behavior, and it's a selection between alternatives, right? And so after you select an alternative, you demonstrate a preference for one thing over another, right? So this is the action axiom. And this is not require free will. Actually, you can be predetermined to have one preference or another. You can argue, oh, is that really a selection amongst alternatives if your actions are predetermined, right? This does not matter, okay? This is just an analytic model to understand human behavior and economics, right? And so now we know what actions are. Let's go for inaction. Let's explain interactions, right? So an interaction is just people engaged in actions together. So actions which affect actions in which multiple people are involved, right? These are interactions, right? So there's two kinds of interactions mainly, right? There's cooperation, which are mutually beneficial interactions. And then there's conflicts, right? Which are unilaterally beneficial / destructive, or mutually destructive. Okay, so and you can and cooperation, of course, requires peace, right? A lack of conflicts. And conflicts often exist in a state of warfare, right? Conflicts, right? Which are, called mutually exclusive actions. Now, so what is cooperation, right? Well, they're mutually beneficial interactions. And let's give the economic example of this, right? So let's say that you got Bob and you got Todd over here, and they're going to sell each other an apple for an orange, right? So they're going to engage in a trade. Right? So they're different fruits, right? And they're going to trade. And why do they? And so they voluntarily agree to this trade, right? So they consent to this trade. And you see that why do they engage in this trade? It's because right? So Bob prefers Todd's orange over his own apple, and Todd prefers Bob's apple over his own orange. So after the exchange, they're both better off than they were before the exchange, right? So Bob values Todd's orange more than Bob values his own apple. Todd values Bob's apple more than his own orange. So after they do an exchange, they both profit, right? So a voluntary transaction is mutually beneficial. And this theory is the basis of economics, right? And so a voluntary transaction are mutually beneficial, and cooperation exists in mutually beneficial interactions and relationships. For example, let's say a positive relationship, whether it's between friends or partners, right? This would be an example of cooperation, because these would be mutually beneficial interactions. And ideally, you only want to experience mutually beneficial interactions, right? So you're either better off experiencing no interaction with other people, or if you do interact with people, ideally you want these to be mutually beneficial interactions, because you benefit and then they benefit, right? And obviously you want to benefit from someone else, right? But you want someone else to benefit from you, because then they can be dependent on you. And so you can both engage in a symbiotic relationship where you can both stand to profit, right? And now you think about the same example, but with money, right? So what is money? Money is basically an invention for the purpose of a more efficient bartering, right? So before the invention of money, you have bartering, you have the exchange of items. But with money, now you don't have to deal with the problem of a double coincidence of wants. So what's the double coincidence of wants? It's when, you have something that other people want, and you want something specifically, but the person that has what you want doesn't want what you have, right? So it's like, for example, let's say you have a cow and you want a goat, right? So you want to trade a cow for a goat. The problem is that there are people who want your cows, right? However, the people who want your cows do not own a goat, right? They don't have goats. And the people who have a goat, they don't want your cow, right? So you need a double coincidence of wants for a bartering economy to be effective. but double coincidences don't always happen. So we need the invention of money, right? And so the purpose of money is to evade the double coincidence of wants problem, and it's also a store of value so that you can now engage in long-term planning and investment with money, right? So the first forms of money are not fiat currency, right? So this picture is wrong. The first forms of money are like gold, or maybe coca beans, or like sugar, or like I don't know, some commodity, right? So the first kinds of currencies are originally something that most people can universally recognize is valuable, and it's easy to store, it's easy to carry around and travel with, and like exchange, right? And it's durable, right? So the first forms of money are, the best form of money is really gold. The first forms of money are always commodities, right? And so even in like a monetary exchange, right? Let's say this time Bob is going to, so look, this is gold, and this is let's see, this is a pizza slice, right? Right, so now this time Bob is going to give Todd 1 gold bar for 1 pizza slice, right? Why does this happen? Because Bob values Todd's pizza slice more than his own bar of gold, and Todd values Bob's golden bar more than his own pizza slice, right? So same thing with money, right? A mutually beneficial exchange, which is voluntary, right? A voluntary exchange benefits both parties at the expense of no one, right? So each party benefits from the exchange, from the transaction. And it's the same thing once you have fiat currency, right? The initial forms of currency, of paper money, the first forms of paper money are all backed by commodities, especially gold, right? Which means that if you want to trade, your paper pieces for gold, right, you can get it back from the bank, right? And so even if it's like, okay, let's say Bob is willing to pay $5 for a pizza, right? He benefits, right? Because he values the pizza slice more than $5. So he profits from the exchange, and the guy who's giving away the pizza profits too, because he values the $5 more than the pizza, right? Same thing if it's $10 or $20, right? So that's cooperation. Now, what are conflicts, right? So conflicts are unilaterally beneficial / destructive, or mutually destructive, right? So let's think of a conflict which is unilaterally beneficial and destructive, right? What it means is that when two people engage in a conflict, it means that there is a contradiction of wills, right? It means that they're engaging in a mutually exclusive action over scarce resources. Why does this happen? Well, why do conflicts happen? The reason conflicts happen is because resources are limited and scarce. What does scarcity mean? Scarcity means that there is not enough goods for everyone who wants it, right? So a good is just an item of value, right? So because there's limited resources, and because people have contradictory goals with the same goods, then they engage in conflicts. So let's give an example, right? So let's say that there is let's say that there is 1 apple, right? And 2 people both want it, right? 2 people both want the apple because there's only 1 apple in the world, right? But because they can't both have the apple, right? They can't both have exclusive control over the apple. They must fight each other, right? So because now they're engaged in a conflict because they have mutually exclusive goals over the apple, right? So now here's Joe, right? Here's Joe, and here's Mac, okay? So Mac wants to eat the entire apple, but Joe also wants to eat the entire apple. So their goals contradict each other because both of their demands cannot be met. So there's a contradiction of wills. Because there's a contradiction of wills, now there's a conflict, right? And so what's going to happen is that they're going to engage in the conflict, right? So they're going to fight each other, right? So maybe they have a boxing match, a wrestling match. They beat each other up. And there's two possibilities. One possibility is that one of these guys wins, right? So let's say Joe wins the fight and he gets the apple. This means that this is a unilaterally beneficial outcome in the conflict where, because Joe wins, okay, he gets the apple and Mac doesn't, right? Mac gets hurt, Mac loses any control over the apple. Joe wins the control over the apple, Mac loses control. And so Mac has to go away, right? And so Joe wins the conflict and Mac loses, right? So in a conflict, someone wins at someone else's expense. There is a victor and a loser. Whereas in an instance of cooperation rather than conflict, in an instance of a voluntary transaction, there are winners and there are no losers, right? So there's a difference between a win-win scenario and a win-lose scenario. Now, there's another possible outcome of a conflict where it's mutually destructive. So rather than unilaterally beneficial and destructive, right? So in the first case, Joe wins the conflict, so he benefits with the apple, and Mac loses the apple, right? So the outcome of a unilateral victory means that one side wins, the other side loses. For one side, the outcome is beneficial. For the other side, the outcome is destructive. Let's consider an outcome where it's destructive for both cases, right? So a mutually destructive outcome will be one where, let's say Joe and Mac get into a fight and they both end up killing each other. Or they get into a fight, and because the fight gets intense, like the apple accidentally ends up getting damaged and it becomes defective, so they can't eat the apple. So in a scenario where neither side gains and both sides is losing, that is a mutually destructive conflict, right? So think of a scenario where both men are in a gun duel, right? They shoot at each other. Because they shoot at each other, they both hit the target and they both die, right? So a conflict where both people die, that's a mutually destructive conflict, right? So you don't want to be in within the category of conflicts. If you want to engage in human interactions, ideally, you want to be in the category of cooperation, right? Because in a world of conflicts, you only have unilaterally beneficial situations where you don't know if you're going to be the winner or the loser, right? How can you possibly know in advance for certain, right? And you and the guy you're in a conflict against might lose and might die, right? And so a world of conflicts would be called warfare, right? Now, you want to be in a world of cooperation where everyone is winning, everyone is profiting, right? So a world of cooperation would be called peace, right? Because peace, which is a lack of conflicts, right? Peace is the precondition for cooperation. So what is the precondition of peace? Right. So the precondition of peace, so peace is a lack of conflicts. So you want this to happen. You want peace to happen. So how do you allow peace to happen, right? You need some rule. And you need some kind of principle, right? You need a principle that avoids all avoidable conflicts, right? And this principle is called private property. Right, so you need the invention of ownership rights, right? So what is private property? The definition of private property is exclusive control rights over a scarce resource. So an ownership title would give you the ultimate right to exclude other people, everyone else, from a scarce resource, right? So this is the principle that avoids all avoidable conflicts. And you want this because you want peace, and peace is a lack of conflicts, right? Now, let's say there's a scarce resource, right? One apple. There's one apple in the world. And so how do we avoid the conflicts? Well, we need, so let's say there's two people competing to own this one apple, right? To have exclusive control rights over this one apple. And why do they want exclusive control rights? Because they want to use it to their advantage and no one else's, right? And only if they have exclusive control over it can they use it to their advantage, right? Because only one of them can finish eating the apple, right? And that is the outcome that they want. So I'm trying to... Why is this not working? Hello? Okay, there we go. So two people, right? Let's call this guy A. Let's call this guy B, right? So A and B both want to be the ultimate decision makers over the apple, right? To be the ultimate decision maker over the apple means to be the owner, the private owner of the apple, right? And so all property must be private, right? There's no such thing as public property, right? Because property by definition is exclusive, right? Property means that if someone has property ownership over one thing, it means that they have exclusive rights over that thing and nobody else does, right? So public property is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, all property is privatized and exclusive, right? And exclusive to a specific owner or a specific set of owners or some specific hierarchy, right? So property has to be exclusive, and there must so for a piece of property to be owned, it must be owned privately, right? Now, public ownership is a contradiction in terms because public ownership just means unowned, right? So nobody knows who owns it because it's not exclusive. There's no exclusive rights to use the property. Therefore, there is no owner. Therefore, public property is a contradiction in terms. It does not exist. Private property is the only valid form of property, right? In fact, private property is the only valid terminology. Public property would be an oxymoron. Property is inherently private. So, let's say you have A and B. So, A and B are both claiming ownership over the apple. A says, I own this apple. I have the absolute right to use it however I want. B says, no, I am B. I have absolute ownership over the property. A does not have rights. So they both are claiming to be the ultimate authority over the apple. So who wins the conflicts, right? There's conflict. Who wins the conflict, right? Well, they want to avoid conflict, so they want to resolve this conflict, right? To resolve this conflict means to resolve it in a peaceful way, right? Means in a non-violent way. They're not going to beat each other up, right? They're not going to kill each other, right? So you need a principle, right? And, the principle is really called the non-aggression principle, right? Which means no initiation of conflicts, right? So you're not allowed to initiate conflicts, right? Now, so how do you resolve this conflict here, right? Only one of them can own the apple. Well, here's the solution, right? So whoever is the first occupier of the apple, so the first person to homestead the apple, or the first person to use the apple, right? The first person to lay an objective ownership claim over the apple, which means he has to physically contact the apple, right? He has to physically interact with the apple and occupy the apple, right? So he has to grab the apple, right? Touch the apple. Right. So the first user of a scarce resource is the owner, right? This is called the first comer principle, right? The first comer ethic. Right. So the first occupier or the first user of a scarce resource is the owner of that property. So he's the owner, and nobody else has a valid claim to the property except him. Right. So let's say B is the first person to visit the apple. He's the first person to hold it in his hand. Therefore, B is the owner. Right. Now, in some situation where they like come across the apple first and they both like touch the apple at the same time, which is very unlikely, then basically whoever lets go of the apple, so whoever basically stops interacting with the apple will basically lose their ownership claim over the apple. So whoever remains interacting with the apple, whoever remains occupying the apple, that's the person who will own the apple, right? Right. So the first user of a property is the owner, because there's no alternative, right? So what is the alternative to the first comer ethic, right? Right. So the first comer ethic. Right. So the first comer ethic is that the first occupier of a resource, of a scarce resource, is the owner of it. What's the alternative? Well, let's consider the non-first comer ethic, so the late comer ethic, right? And remember, none of these are my ideas. All of these are ideas from Hans-Hermann Hoppe and Murray Rothbard, right? So shout out to Hoppe, Hoppe, right? Late comer ethic is someone who comes after the first comer. Right. So let's consider the latecomer ethic. A latecomer ethic would be someone who comes after the first comer owns the scarce resource, right? So let's say that you got B over here, right? B is the first person to claim ownership over the resource, right? But then A comes later, right? A comes later and says, hey, no, that's my apple, right? B is like, no, I came here first. I grabbed the apple first, therefore the apple is mine. And A says, no, so A kills B, right? And now A claims ownership over the apple, right? The problem is that C will come along, right? C is going to come along and tell A, hey, A, I am the latecomer, therefore I own the apple, right? And A is gonna bitch about it, right? Because he's a pussy, right? So A is gonna complain, and C is gonna kill this guy, right? So now C is claiming ownership over the apple, right? But D is not it's not fan of the status quo, right? So maybe the apple is rotting at this point because like it's been fighting for a very long time. But no, D says to C, hey, I'm the latecomer, so I'm going to kill you, right? And now D claims ownership over the apple, right? And now E comes along. And right now, D has possession over the apple. He claims ownership, right? But E is like, hey, fuck you, D. I'm going to kill you, right? So E kills D, and now E claims ownership. So, okay, here's the problem. A latecomer ethic leads to an infinite regress, right? So nobody actually ends up owning the apple, and like everyone just starves to death, right? Nobody can eat. So a latecomer ethic leads to infinite regress, and it doesn't resolve the conflicts, right? A latecomer ethic cannot resolve all avoidable conflicts. It cannot avoid conflicts. Therefore, the latecomer ethic is false, and therefore the first comer ethic is true, right? So the first comer ethic is called the homesteading principle in libertarian legal theory, or you can say anarcho-capitalist legal theory, which is the correct ideology. Now, let me look at my notes here. Okay, so now we have a system of private property, right? Because everyone respects their private property rights, right? So now everyone can amass wealth, right? It means they can amass resources, right? So with a private property world, you have capitalism, right? So what is capitalism, right? Capitalism is private ownership of resources, right? And means of production, right? Which are kind of resource, right? And so when a capitalist society, what does a capitalist society mean? It means that nobody violates private property rights. Everyone follows the first comer principle. And so everyone has property rights. And so what does it mean? It means people can amass wealth, right? So what does amassing wealth mean? It means people can amass and accumulate resources, right? It means that you can stack apples together. So right, you can have 10 apples and leave it in your house, and therefore when you get hungry, you can eat it without having to like grow an apple and wait, a year for the apple tree and then extract the apple. No, you can just, you don't need to wait, okay? You can just eat it, right? Because you stored it from your previous exchanges or labor, right? So because private property makes it so that people can't steal your objects, right? Or your money, right? So with private property, right? If everyone's following private property, then no one's stealing your goods, no one's stealing your resources, no one's burning down your house, right? No one's like taking your apples, no one's taking your commodities or money, right? Because no one's stealing from each other, everyone can amass wealth. Now you can have a complex economy, okay? What does this mean? So because everyone can amass wealth, right? Right. Everyone has assets, right? Because everyone can accumulate wealth, now they have leisure time, right? Now they have free time to where they can do whatever they want and they don't have to worry about starving to death or dying, right? Now they can develop trades, right? Now they can develop skills, right? Productive trades, right? Right. So now look. So now they can engage in the division of labor, right? So with private property, now people can basically store the value of their exchanges, right? And they can enjoy the fruits of their labor in the money, right? Like money isn't a perfect store of value, but it's a good approximation. And so now they have free time because they're wealthy now, right? So they, now everyone, because no one's stealing from each other, and everyone everyone's recognizing each other's private property rights. Then if you're if you're providing a lot of value to people by selling apples and by building houses for people, by writing books, by providing valuable goods and services, right? By helping people, build furniture, make swords, sell people cows, you're breeding livestock, right? You're providing you're making bread, right? You're farming, right? You're providing valuable services to other people, and in exchange, people will give you things, right? So you bake a piece of bread for someone gives you an apple, right? You sell someone a cow, someone gives you $100, right? You help someone build a house, someone gives you $10,000, right? So people are able to store away their assets, they're able to store away their money, right? And the net effect is that now people have a lot of free time. With this free time, they can develop skills. They can develop specialized skills, right? So you can spend all your time practicing mastering one art, right? You're practicing being very good at one activity so that you're even better at providing services for that activity, right? So you spend all your time practicing cooking or singing or construction work or breeding livestock or writing books or planting apples or farming, right? And so you spend all your time practicing one skill, and therefore you're very good at providing this valuable service and producing valuable goods for people. And not only do you provide high quality services that other people demand and are willing to pay you for, but you're also dependent on other people, right? Because you only have one skill. You're only really good at one thing, but you're bad at everything else. You don't have skills that other people have. So you have to depend on other people for your survival and to obtain the goods and services that you want, right? So in a complex division of labor, where everyone specializes in their respective trades, not only does each individual have something valuable to provide what other people don't have, but also people are dependent on each other to obtain their survival and the goods that they want. This is division of labor, a complex division of labor, which is the sign of civilization, right? This is the basis of civilization. Why do people cooperate and get along so well? right? Because they have something valuable to provide other people that other people are willing to pay for, and because they're dependent on other people for their demands and needs. So private property is a precondition, right? Because a precondition of a complex economy. So a complex economy requires a division of labor. The precondition for a division of labor is private property. The precondition of private property is peace, right? What's peace? A lack of conflicts, right? And you need private property for a lack of conflicts. Now, let's see. Now, what is the opposite of private property, right? So there's So let me make the explanation of what capitalism and socialism is, right? So capitalism is adherence to private property, right? And so where socialism is the violation of private property, right? So it's theft. Right. So what is capitalism? Capitalism is the adherence to private property rights, and in a capitalist economy, everyone is engaged in voluntary transaction. So people are productive, right? And they're creative, and they engage in mutually beneficial exchanges, right? Because in a capitalist economy, the only way to obtain the goods and services you want is to provide goods and services that other people also want. So if you want to make money in a capitalist society, you have to provide items and things of value that other people are willing to pay for voluntarily, right? Now, what is socialism? Socialism is the opposite of capitalism. Socialism is the violation of private property. So socialism is theft. Socialism is the institutionalization of theft. Institutionalization, right? And so basically, socialism is parasitism upon capitalism. Socialism is the parasite. Capitalism is the host. Capitalism is the productive substrate. Socialism is the leech, right? Socialism is value destructive. Capitalism is value additive, right? Socialism is anti-productive. Capitalism is productive, right? So, you can think of it this way, right? Capitalism is the host, right? And socialism is the leech, right? Socialism is the parasite upon capitalism, right? So what are examples of socialism, right? Stealing, right? Robbery, fraud, right? Warfare. So socialism is inherently conflict-driven. Capitalism is peace-driven, right? Because capitalism follows private property, and private property avoids all avoidable conflicts. Then socialism is the opposite. Socialism increases conflicts, and socialism, whereas capitalism is peaceful and cooperative, socialism is warlike and anti-cooperative and conflict-driven, right? So socialism is about conflict, capitalism is about peace, right? Socialism is about conflicts, capitalism is about a lack of conflict and private property. Capitalism is about voluntary exchanges where both parties benefit. Socialism is about conflicts where either one party benefits at the expense of the other or both parties stand to lose. Right. Now, now we understand, right? So now let's make the distinction between the private economy and the public, the private sector of the economy and the public sector of the economy, right? So you have an economy. And you have the public sector. So there's two sectors to economies nowadays, right? There's a private sector and there's the public sector. So the private sector is the productive host and the public sector is the anti-productive parasite, right? So what is the private sector? The private sector is profit driven, right? And in the private sector, there are only voluntary transactions, right? And private property rights are respected, right? So an example would be, right, I sell you a TV and you pay me, like, let's say $50, right? With inflation, this is unlikely nowadays, right? Because of fractional reserve banking. I'll get to that later. So, right, here's a voluntary exchange, right? Both parties benefit right, at nobody's expense, right? Nobody is losing from this scenario, right? Because you pay me $50, I pay you a TV, right? We make a trade. You gain a TV, which you value more than $50. I gain $50, which I value more than the TV. So everyone profits, right? So every interactor, right? Every transactor profits in the private sector, right? So it's driven by demand, consumer demand. So the private sector is driven by consumer demand, and it's about the production of goods, right? Goods which are items of value or services, right? Or so really, okay, a service is a good, okay, and a service is an item of value, right? So private sector is about the production of goods. Now, what's the public sector? So the public sector is not profit driven; it is theft driven, right? It's fraud driven. Right? It's about involuntary transgressions, right? So aggression, right? It's theft driven. It's conflict driven, right? And it's not about it. And they produce bats, right? So in the public sector, they don't produce goods, which are items of value. They produce bats, which are undesired items, right? Items which cause a net loss, right? So in the public sector, what happens is basically you are held at gunpoint, right? And then they steal your money, right? Right. Right. So what happens is that in the public sector, rather than providing a good or service of value that the consumer wants, right? Rather than having a voluntary transaction where right, I give you what you want, you give me what I want, right? A voluntary transaction where both parties benefit. In the public sector, what happens is that basically I force you to give me your money or to give me your goods and services. And if you disagree, I will shoot you and I will kill you, right? I will execute you, right? So this is basically what the state does. Think about taxation, for example, right? What happens in taxation is that the state, the tax man comes in and he steals your money, right? So let's say you make $50,000 a year. So he'll steal $10,000 from you, right? For example. And so you have to let him do it or he'll kill you, right? So let's say you keep letting him steal your money, right? And then you realize, hey, stop stealing my money, right? Because you're doing nothing to benefit me, right? Rather than producing goods that benefit me, you're producing bads like warfare and innocent people dying. And, you're increasing the homelessness rate. You're increasing the unemployment rate with terrible monetary policy, right? The roads are not well built. There's too many accidents happening. The crime rate is going up. So you're telling the government, hey, you're stealing my money and you're not even benefiting me, okay? So what you can do is that, okay, when the tax man knocks on your door and says, hey, give me your money, what you will say instead, you're a citizen, you'll say, no, I will not give you my money. You are a thief. Go away. What the taxman will do is he will call up the police. The police will come up and they will show up to your doorstep with guns, right? And these police will say, hey, pay your taxes or we will kill you, right? And then what you will say is, no, I will defend myself, right? So you pull out your gun, right? But then the police kill you, right? Because you're outnumbered, right? There's 10 policemen and there's you with you're trying to defend yourself, but the police outnumber you, so they kill you, right? Or, you try to resist arrest and then they send you to jail and then you starve, right? And so, basically taxation is theft, right? So, that's what the public sector does. The public sector steals your money by force, and if you don't like it, they will kill you, right? And that's what the government does. And so basically, whereas the private sector, they produce value, right? They are productive, they are creative, they produce items of value, they produce goods and services people actually want. The public sector produces bads, which nobody wants, right? So the public sector steals your money and it will spend it on murdering innocent people in foreign countries, right? I'm going to steal your money. I am the government. I am the state. I am the public sector. I steal your money. I'm going to spend $1 million on buying one toothbrush, right? I want to steal more of your money. So people will complain that, oh, this public program isn't doing very well, okay? My solution is I will steal more money because I'll say, oh, we're being underfunded, right? We need to steal more money, right? So let's say there's a construction project and the goal is to build an apartment, right? A private sector company, right? A private firm would want to maximize profit at building this construction company, at building this construction design, right? They want to build an apartment, so they want to do it as cheaply as possible and as efficiently as possible, and in a way which will satisfy the demands of the consumers, right? So so the private firm will make an efficient use of the scarce resources, and he will build the apartment in the most competent way possible, so that the consumers of the apartment, the residents, will be happy at the result, right? And so the investors and the consumers will be happy at the end goal, and they will waste as little resources as possible, right? On the other hand, the public sector, if they try to build an apartment, they do not care about the consumers, right? Because if you're the public sector, why do you care about the residents of the apartment? Or why do you care about the actual users of your service, right? You could just steal more from them. Why do you care? Because look, if they don't like your resources, if you don't like, if your customers, so if you're a public sector entity like the government, right, and people don't like what you provide them, you can just kill them or you can steal more of their money, right? So you don't actually need to provide anything good, right? So if you're the public sector, you actually don't want to be efficient with building this apartment, right? You might want to spend 1,000 years building one apartment, right? Because then you can steal more money in that period of time. You also want to use more money, right? You have to steal more money, right? You don't want to build the apartment cheaply as possible, right? You want to make up lies like we are being underfunded. We are being underfunded, therefore we need to take more money out of your pockets. We need to extract more resources. We need to be a bigger parasite. We need to add more departments to the office of building this apartment, right? So maybe every single window on the apartment needs a department to regulate that particular window, right? Maybe every oxygen molecule in the apartment needs to be regulated and federally supervised, right? So maybe you need a license for every blade of grass that's on the apartment premises, right? maybe, you know, the height of the apartment is something that takes 100 years to debate, right? So should the apartment be 500 meters tall or 499 or maybe 500.6, right? So you need to have a million different debates. You need to fund all these debates, you know, and so you need to steal more money, right? So the public sector is driven by greed and stealing money, whereas the private sector is driven by entrepreneurship. It's driven by, you know, facing demands of the consumers despite uncertain outcomes. So the private sector allocates resources efficiently and achieves goals in the most cost-effective and satisfying way possible with the given resources and particular conditions, whereas the public sector often does not even achieve the goals, but often they don't even have goals. Their only goal is to steal more money, right? So with the private sector, right, they'll be like, okay, we'll finish the apartment project, we'll build it in 5 years, and we'll spend $1 million, and, you know, we'll have a checkup to make sure it's safe, and everyone's happy, right? But the public sector will be like, no, we just spent 1,000 years building this one apartment, and we need to make up a bunch of processes so that we can extract more money from the host, right? We need to steal more money from the productive people. And so think about this, right? Let's say people criticize the government and they say to the public sector, hey, you're spending too long building this apartment. Hey, you're wasting resources. You're wasting bricks and glass, and you're wasting soil, right? You're wasting metals, and you're wasting labor, right? You're wasting gasoline, right? You're wasting all these resources building this apartment. Hey, government, hey, you bureaucratic officials, right? You guys are wasting our money. You guys are wasting our resources. Please stop doing this. What the government will say is that, no, we don't care, okay? Us government officials, if you don't like what we're doing, we're going to put you in prison, or we're going to kill you, and we're going to keep stealing your money, right? And so that's basically what the public sector does. Now let's see if you complain to the private sector, okay? So if you complain to the construction company who's in charge of making this apartment, right? There's two possibilities. The private sector can be like, okay, the private construction company can be like, okay, you guys are right. We're gonna try to take in your feedback, and we're going to improve our product, right? That's what they can do, which is good, right? The second option is that the private sector will say, no, we will not comply with your demands, and we're just gonna do what we want to do, even if you guys don't like it, right? But then the consumers of the private construction company, they'll be like, hey man, we're gonna stop giving you money. And then the private construction company goes bankrupt, and then their competitor takes the market share, right? So the private sector is in a life or death dilemma. If they don't satisfy the consumer demands, their business will stop existing and it will stop getting money, because they have to operate on the principle of voluntary transactions, right? They can't put... So look, your gym is not going to put a gun to your head and force you to buy a gym membership, right? The clothing store or the grocery store, they're not going to kill you if you don't spend money at their locations, right? Like a private vendor is not going to punch you in the face just because you don't give them money. Whereas the public sector, the government, right? They will lock you up and they will kill you if you don't let them steal your money from you while you are sleeping. So that's basically the difference between the private sector and the public sector, right? And so the private sector is socialism, right? The public sector is socialism, right? So the public sector actions, all the actions which exist within the public sector, all the entities and the outcomes which derive from the public sector consists of socialist activities, right? So the public sector of the economy is inherently socialist because they violate private property rights, right? On the other hand, the private sector is inherently capitalist, right? Because capitalism is all about voluntary exchanges, it's all about profit, it's all about efficiency and maximizing gain, and it's all about peace, right? So capitalism, right? So the private sector is capitalist and the public sector is socialist, right? So the private sector of the economy is inherently capitalistic and the public sector of the economy is inherently socialistic, right? Now, let me explain how banking works in capitalism and socialism, right? Banking, right? I have a bank here. Right, and so people are basically what happens is okay, you store so what is a bank? Okay, a bank is a place. A bank is originally a place you can go to store your money, right? So originally, money was always backed by a currency, which means that you could always exchange money for a currency, usually gold, right? Why gold? Because people generally find it very valuable. And gold is also a commodity that can actually be used in I think electric devices or like jewelry, right? So gold has value as a commodity. It also has value as, something considered very just aesthetically pleasing. It also is easy to store. It's durable. It's easy to carry around, right? So gold is naturally like the gold standard, right? Gold is naturally the original form of money. And before, banks used to be on the gold standard, right? Now, so this means that you could exchange paper pieces of money for gold, right? So let's say that you own gold, right? So how does gold become paper money, right? You own gold. You put your gold bars into the bank. They put it in a safe to make sure that no one steals it, and to make sure that you could you're safe and sound. You feel that you can obtain your money again whenever you want it, right? So now you put $100 of gold in a bank, and then they give you a $100 IOU, right? They give you a piece of paper that has $100, right? Because your bar of gold is worth $100. So whatever you want to trade the paper piece, the bank note for the gold, then they can make the transaction, and then you get your gold back, right? So you could always exchange your bank notes, your paper currency for the gold, right, under a gold standard. And maybe a bank will like charge a fee for the service of like protecting your money and making sure you can exchange the paper pieces for gold, right? So that's basically what a bank is under capitalism, right? And then if there's some risk with a bank, like maybe they invest your money, like they'll tell you about it, right? Because if you don't like the way that the bank, if a private bank under a capitalist system is using your money in a way that you don't like, then you could complain, and they have to take your feedback into consideration and act differently, or they lose money, right? Now let's consider banking under socialism, right? So right, so under a socialist banking system, what you do is that you put $100 in the bank, and then they steal your money, right? So how do they steal your money? So what happens is that when you store $100 in basically they engage in something called fractional reserve banking, right? Which means that your money is backed by nothing, right? And here, capitalism is backed by gold standard, right? So gold standard just means you can trade bank notes for gold, right? And there's always a supply of gold, right? There's a supply of gold that's proportionate to the supply of banknotes that are circulating in the economy, right? So, the supply of gold equals supply of banknotes actually in the economy, right? And what is fractional reserve banking? Fractional reserve banking equals the bank basically commits fraud, right? They steal your money, right? So the bank steals your money and pretends they didn't, right? So how does fractional reserve banking work? This is socialist banking at its finest, right? We'll show you, okay? So first you have to understand what the Federal Reserve is, right? Or what a central bank is. A central bank is basically a monopoly of currency, right? A monopoly of fiat money. A monopoly of fiat money, basically it's a criminal organization, and so they are a counterfeiting enterprise, right? And so here's the central bank, right? And so how does the central bank obtain a monopoly of currency? Well, because the state exists. And so if you try to print your own money, the state will kill you for engaging in counterfeit, right? So let's say a random schmo over here, right? He prints money. Right? He prints some money. Right. Money. And then he's killed for counterfeit, right? So basically, if a normal person, if you and I try to print money out of thin air and basically try to extract value from the economy without actually providing anything of value ourselves, right? So if we engage in the parasitic behavior of fractional reserve banking or quantitative easing or just printing money out of nothing, right? If we engage in inflationary monetary policy like the central bank does, if we try to print money out of thin air, then we will be charged with counterfeit and we will be killed, right? So the military will come in and we'll die, right? So you're not allowed to do this, right? But the central bank does the same thing, and they call it monetary policy, right? So central bank engages in excessive fiat printing, counterfeit, and they make up. They call it monetary inflation, right? It's really monetary inflation, which is just the accurate economic term, but they call it like quantitative easing, right? They call it monetary policy, right? A bunch of nonsense terms that don't mean anything, right? So forget about this, right? And so, okay, the central bank wants to steal your money, right? So what the central bank is that they will print money out of their ass. So what happens, right? So let's say here's the economy, right? Here's the economy. And in the economy, there is scarcity, right? There's scarcity, which means there's, limited resources, and there's not enough resources for everyone to be satisfied, right? And so, let's say there's only 5 apples in the economy, right? And there's only 3 Lamborghinis in the economy, right? So these are Lamborghinis, right? And so this is the central banker, right? This is the central banker, right? There's a Federal Reserve, right? And what he's going to do, he's going to print money with magic, right? He's just going to inject fiat into the economy, right? So he's going to give himself $1 billion. He's going to give himself $1 billion. No, $1 trillion, right? He's going to give himself $1 trillion, right? And of course he's going to give it to himself, right? When he prints the money, he gives it to himself, right? The central banker. And then he gives it to his cronies, right? So he gives it to his cronies, right? So, the political elites, right? Right, some you know, right, his corporate friends, right, maybe war criminals, right, and then he prints money out of his ass, right, and he gives it to himself, and he gives some of it to political elites, he gives some of it to corporate friends, right, and he gives some of his the newly printed fiat to war criminals so that he can kill people, right, and so then what he does is that he takes the money he gives himself, right, and he spends it on apples, right, so he buys 3 apples and he buys 2 Lamborghinis. So look, now they all go to him, right? So they're off the market, right? So look at what happened, right? Before, there were 3 Lamborghinis in the entire economy, right? And now the central banker, because he print money out of his ass, and he didn't earn any money by providing anything of value, right? He provided nothing of value. He simply extracted 2 Lamborghinis out of the market just by printing money out of his ass, just by counterfeiting. Same thing, right? Same thing with apples, right? There were 5 apples in the economy. Now, because he magically produced fiat and stimulated the economy with it, right? He basically just gave the money to himself, and he's able to steal 3 apples from the economy, right? By doing nothing but being a criminal, right? So basically, what central bankers do, what the Federal Reserve does, right? What these monetary inflationists do, right? What this government monopoly of the monetary supply, what they do, okay, is they steal resources from everyone else, right? They steal resources from the productive people, and then we have to bear the cost. How do we bear the cost? Through inflation, right? Because they're going to steal resources from the people, and now there's more money circulating in the economy because more has been printed, but there's more money in the economy chasing fewer items, right? So the ratio of money to items in the economy has gone up, right? So also, because they print the money, so they're first recipients of the money because they print the money and they give it to themselves, right? These political crooks, right? These political elites, these central bankers, these war criminals, right? So they give themselves the money, and they're first people to receive the money, which means they're first people to spend it, right? So when they spend the money, they're spending the money at a time when the economy's prices are relatively low. But after they spend the money trickles down and circulates around the economy. So now the prices increase because there's more monetary supply in the economy, right? So the prices increase and people deal with price inflation, right? So the cost of the goods and the cost of resources go up, right? But it doesn't affect the central bankers, right? The central bankers don't care if prices go up for you, which they will. Because the central bankers, they can print money anyways. They can just get things for free, right? But you have to bear the cost through inflation, right? So really, central banking, the Federal Reserve, these crooked public bankers, these crooked monetary policy people, right? These Keynesians, they are criminals, right? They support criminal organizations. They steal from people, right? That's what they do. They steal from people, and you bear the cost through price inflation. You bear the cost because now your savings, your limited set of money that you own, it's worth less now, right? It's worth less. So that's how Federal Reserve banking works, right? And now that's the central banking, right? Quantitative easing, inflationary monetary policy. That's what it is. It's stealing, right? Now, what is fractional reserve banking, right? So in a normal bank, right? Think about it. In a normal bank, right? In a regular bank, you have an account, right? Right. Let's say you put $100 in your bank account. In a private bank, in a bank that hasn't been poisoned by fractional reserve banking, in a bank with reserves, right? In a bank with reserves, when you put $100 in the bank account, the $100 stays in the bank account. So you leave, right? The $100 is always going to be there, right? And if you want to take out the money, you can take out the money. So there's no problem. So there's no problem in a regular bank, right? You put $100 in an account, the $100 stays there, right? The money in your account stays in the account. It doesn't teleport away. It doesn't disappear. Whenever you want to take the money out, you can do it. So now fractional reserve banking. What happens in fractional reserve banking, right? It's that now, right? What you're gonna do is you're gonna put $100 in the account, right? And what's gonna happen is that there's gonna be no money in your account, right? Why is there no money in your account, right? So what the central bankers have done, right? What these fractional reserve bankers have done is that they have stolen your money, right? Why? Because they're going to take, so you put $100 in your account, they're gonna take $100 out and they're gonna loan it to someone else, right? They're gonna loan it to businesses, they're gonna loan it to their friends, they're gonna loan it to the military industrial complex so that people can get killed for no reason, right? So they're gonna take your money and they're gonna spend it on whatever, right? Maybe they buy a Lamborghini, right? And, they buy a vacation to Hawaii, right? So the central bankers, the fractional reserve bankers, you put $100 into the bank account, they take your money and they spend it elsewhere, right? So, but what's the problem here? The problem here is that if you ask for your money back, theoretically they couldn't give it to you because they already spent it on a loan, or loaning it out to some risky business, right? But don't worry, because what they'll do is they'll just print money out their ass, right? So now it's $100 with an asterisk, right? So now they print another, so they spent your $100, but they printed another $100 with an asterisk. Why is there an asterisk? Because it's counterfeit money, right? So they're gonna counterfeit $100. So to cover up the fact that they stole $100 from you, they print some out of their ass. So they print the same $100 out of their ass, and they say it's yours. It's not really yours because your $100 is really worth like $80 now, right? It's worth $80 now, right? Because because first of all, by printing more money out their ass and spending more, they've decreased the value of money, right? Because they're misallocating it, right? They're wasting the money, right? Because they're obviously, when you spend someone else's money, you're going to make less profitable decisions because it's just like, right? If you punch someone else in the face, you don't feel hurt, right? So a lot of people, right? They punch other people in the face and they don't care, right? But if you punch yourself in the face, you'll feel hurt, right? So that's why you don't punch yourself in the face. You punch other people, right? Same reason, right? Why? If you spend your own money, you're not going to buy a Lamborghini. You're not going to buy a $10 million hamburger, right? You're not going to build some golden statue, right? You're not going to go to 10 vacations around the world, right? But if you spend someone else's money, then it's like, okay, yeah, I'll buy a Lamborghini. Yeah, you're right. I will build a 1 million acre castle, right? Yeah, I'm spending someone else's money. So, yeah, I'll, build 1,000 houses and yeah, I'll go on 10 vacations. Yeah, right. And actually your money might actually be worth less than $80, right? So at first it's worth $80, then it's worth $60, right? So, and then it's worth $20, right? So your money, so in a monetary inflationist economy, right? In an economy with all this fractional reserve banking, all this inflationary monetary policy, all this corrupt central banking, what happens is that your money is worth less over time, right? So they're stealing your money, right? But they're doing it in a way that people don't understand. The reason is because people are stupid, right? People don't understand their money being stolen from because they're stupid and they are slaves and they're sheep, right? So they don't understand. Now let's look at let's look at some facts, right? So people assume that the economy is capitalist, right? What, for some reason, okay. But we can see here, right? See with this infographic that I made. Look, right? So we can see here, why does this look so scuffed? Right? So we have to understand that people assume that Western civilization is a bastion of capitalism. People assume that Western civilization is capitalist and that the world, the global economy is capitalist. This is false, right? Western civilization is only 50% capitalist at most, right? So if you look at Western civilizations, if you look at European countries, right? You go to the Netherlands, you go to the Scandinavian countries, you go to France, Germany, United States, Canada, Britain, right? In most Western countries, taxation is greater than 30%. And we explained that taxation is theft, taxation is socialist, taxation is parasitism, right? We see that Western nations have trillions of dollars in public debts, right? That's public sector activity where money is being stolen from, right? And not being paid back, right? So Western nations have trillions of dollars in public debt. So you have to see that states, right? Western states, these so-called democratic states, right? In these governments, the markets on law and military are monopolized by the states, right? So let's say you disagree with the government's laws. You can't appeal to a competing private legal firm, right? No, you have to agree with the law set by the state. So the law has a so the state has a monopoly over the law, right? Meaning that the law is going to be very inefficient because the law is going to be in favor of parasitism rather than profit, which means that the law is going to be parasitic rather than productive, which means the law is going to waste your money rather than help you make money, which means the law is going to squander resources rather than increase resources, which means justice is going to be highly inefficient, expensive, and contradictory, right? So it's not even going to be justice. The government legal system is going to destroy justice rather than producing justice because governments are inherently value destructive rather than value productive, right? So whereas a private legal system would actually produce valuable justice, a public legal system, a government monopolized legal system will destroy justice and will engage in injustice like murdering random people in the Middle East. We still don't know why they do this, right? So law and military markets are monopolized by the state. It's a public monopoly, right? If you try to make your own laws or you start your own military, you'll be killed, right? You'll be killed by the monopoly of force. So manufacturing, agriculture. So these look at these sectors of the economy, right? Manufacturing, agriculture, retail, finance, healthcare, and many other sectors. So virtually every sector in the economy is regulated by the state, right? And state regulation is socialistic, it's parasitic, it's a violation of private property rights. Therefore, none of these sectors are fully capitalistic, right? The Federal Reserve has a monopoly on the monetary supply, and it is an arm of the state, right? So the Federal Reserve is obviously a state-produced entity. They'll pretend like, oh, the Federal Reserve is separate from the state, okay? So why is it that if I produce counterfeit money, I would be killed or I would go to prison? But if the Federal Reserve does the same thing I do, they are given a pass and they can steal everyone's money, right? Why is this the case? Because the government supports counterfeits when they do it, right? The government supports stealing when they do it, right? So many big corporations collude with the state to gain oligarchic, monopolistic privileges that hamper free market competition, which is corporate socialism and not capitalism, right? So corporations nowadays, they collude with the government, they collude with the state to gain oligarchic and monopolistic advantages, right? For example, if I'm a corporation, I will sort of like suck up to the government. Like if I'm a corporation, right, I will lobby the government to enact laws that will be in my favor and that will destroy my competitors, right? And this is a violation of free market economics, right? This is a violation because rather than abiding by the principle of voluntary transactions, what I'm doing is that if my competitors don't allow me to have an unfair advantage, right? If my competitors don't advantage me for no reason, then they will be killed, right? That's how the law works nowadays. So another thing is that there are illegitimate borders that restrict free movement and free trade, right? So in a voluntary society, right, in a society founded on free trade, then you wouldn't have illegitimate borders. You wouldn't have arbitrary borders on land that just prevent people from moving. It makes no sense. Like imagine if, if the moment you step outside your house, you're an illegal alien, right? The moment that you leave your neighborhood, imagine that you're committing a crime, right? It's like, oh, I'm gonna walk outside my own garage. Okay, now you are violating a law, right? Now you're violating some border law. It's nonsense, right? Like the idea of public borders is nonsense because they're unowned borders anyways, right? Like what gives a criminal organization, the state, the right to discern where borders are delineated, right? It's nonsense. So there's tariffs. There's a lot of tariffs on the economy, which restrict free trade. Tariffs are a socialist contrivance. Tariffs are a parasitic invention of the state. Therefore, they are anti-capitalistic. Okay. States also have a monopoly on roads and transportation. Not only does state monopolies on roads and transportations, these public monopolies, not only do they cause more accidents than would be the case, right? Because accidents are not very profitable, right? So if I was a private company and I owned a road and there were 1 million accidents happening every year, nobody's going to go to my road. Nobody's going to invest in my company. No one's going to give me money, right? But if my road has 0 accidents and my road is very safe, it's clean, it looks good, right? Then people will give me money. So in a private market on roads and traffic and transportation, then people would be able to move around freely, right? Relatively speaking, and they would be safe, right? But states have a monopoly on roads and transportation, which restricts free movement, right? Which is obviously a violation of the principle of voluntary exchange and free trade. So this is proof that most Western societies are mixed markets, are more socialist than capitalist, right? So I've shown that actually the global economy and Western civilization as a whole is more socialistic than capitalistic, and that's why the economy is so inefficient and there are many unmet demands. Therefore, there are many mismatches in supply and demand, right? Because in a free market, where it's about voluntary transaction, then supply will meet demand over time and meet a favorable equilibrium. Whereas in a socialist market, supply will not meet demand. Because in a free market, you can pay and get what you want. In a socialist market, you will not get what you want, and sometimes you will get killed, right? So that's basically how the economy works. So now let's look. Let me see. So I think I covered everything I wanted. Okay, so that being said, okay, thank you for watching the video, and I hope you learned about the economy now.